The night in Fairmont Crest had the kind of heavy, unsettling stillness that always seemed to arrive right before a secret exploded into the open, and in that uneasy calm, Tomas made a decision that would ripple through every corner of Bill's already unstable world, because what he carried in his hand was not just a small vial, but a weaponized piece of truth, one that had been buried, denied, and manipulated until it became something far more dangerous than its original intent. And when Tomas finally walked into Bill's private office, closing the door behind him with a controlled precision that betrayed how tense he actually was, he didn't waste time on pleasantries, didn't soften the blow, didn't even sit down. Instead, he simply reached into his coat and placed the vial on the polished surface of Bill's desk, the glass catching the dim light in a way that made it look almost innocent at first glance, almost harmless. But Bill's instincts immediately told him otherwise, because nothing Tomas brought him ever came without consequences, and Bill, already dealing with fractures in his control over his own life, narrowed his eyes and leaned forward slightly, demanding without words an explanation, though Tomas gave him nothing at first except silence, a silence thick enough to suffocate, until finally Tomas spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of something irreversible. "This vial," he said, "belonged to Hayley, or rather it had been taken from Hayley's possession, and more importantly, it was identified as poison, not just any chemical residue or harmless compound, but a carefully formulated substance that could incapacitate, and in the wrong dosage, kill." And the moment those words left Tomas's mouth, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, because Bill knew exactly what this meant even before Tomas finished explaining. He knew it meant betrayal, it meant manipulation, and it meant that Hayley's already fragile position in his life had just become a full-blown legal and moral crisis. But what made it worse, what made Bill's jaw tighten and his hands curl slowly into fists, was Tomas's final revelation. The vial had not simply been discovered, it had been given, handed over deliberately, and not by accident, but by design, and the person who delivered it to Bill's orbit was someone who had been playing a much deeper game than anyone had realized. Someone who had been watching the pieces shift while remaining just out of sight. And as Tomas explained that it was Bill who now needed to decide what to do with it, the implication was unmistakable, because this wasn't just evidence, it was leverage, it was a trigger, and it was a threat wrapped in glass, and Bill, who had built his entire life on control and retaliation, suddenly found himself holding something that could either destroy Hayley completely or expose a conspiracy that might bring down more than one person in Fairmont Crest. And as he stared at the vial, memories and suspicions began colliding in his mind, especially concerning Hayley's recent behavior, her evasiveness, her carefully constructed explanations, the moments she had avoided his questions about where she had been and who she had been meeting, and suddenly those gaps no longer felt like coincidences, but like calculated omissions. Yet even as anger began to rise in him, there was another layer underneath it, something more complicated, because Hayley had also been someone he trusted, in ways he didn't fully admit even to himself. Someone who had stood beside him during moments of instability, someone who had offered comfort when his world was unraveling, and now that same person was being connected to poison, and Tomas, watching Bill's reaction carefully, added another layer of tension by revealing that the vial had traces consistent with recent handling, meaning it had not been hidden away for long, meaning it had been in circulation recently, possibly during one of Hayley's most unexplained absences, and that detail alone was enough to make Bill's mind spiral into darker possibilities, because if Hayley had been carrying poison, then the question wasn't just why, but for whom, and under what circumstances she would ever consider using it. And in that silence that followed Tomas's explanation, Bill stood slowly, walking around his desk as if distance might give him clarity. But instead it only amplified the storm building inside him, because every scenario he constructed led to either betrayal or manipulation, and neither option left Hayley innocent, and yet neither option gave him the satisfaction of simple revenge either, because what Tomas had done by placing the vial in his hands was not just delivering evidence, it was forcing Bill into a decision that could fracture alliances, expose hidden loyalties, and potentially ignite a chain reaction that would pull in names like Hayley, Tomas, and even others whose involvement had not yet surfaced. And as Bill finally spoke, his voice low and controlled but edged with something dangerously sharp, He asked Tomas why he was bringing this to him instead of law enforcement, instead of following protocol, and Tomas's answer was simple but chilling, because this wasn't just a crime scene development, it was a chess move, and Bill was one of the few players strong enough to respond without immediately collapsing the board. And that meant responsibility, but also opportunity, and Bill understood that immediately because Tomas was not just informing him, he was inviting him to act, to decide whether Hayley would be confronted, protected, or used as a bargaining piece in something far larger than either of them were openly acknowledging, and the weight of that realization pressed down on Bill as he picked up the vial between two fingers, studying it more closely now, noticing the faint residue, the way it clung to the glass like a whisper of intent, and he thought about Hayley again. Not just as a suspect, but as a person, remembering her expressions, her contradictions, the way she sometimes seemed both deeply invested in him and simultaneously miles away, as if she were constantly balancing two lives that were never meant to intersect, and Tomas, sensing the shift in Bill's focus from rage to calculation, pressed further by suggesting that Hayley might not be the origin of the poison, but merely a carrier. Bill sat in his office long after Tomas left, the door still feeling warm from the pressure of the conversation that had just taken place, and the vial remained exactly where he had placed it, centered on the desk like a silent accusation that refused to be ignored, because no matter how many times he tried to shift his focus elsewhere, his eyes kept returning to it, as if it had begun to anchor itself into his reality, changing the shape of every assumption he had ever made about Hayley, about trust, about control, and about how quickly a carefully constructed life could begin to unravel. And outside those walls, Fairmont Crest continued its usual rhythm of appearances and hidden agendas, but inside Bill's office time felt suspended, compressed into a narrow corridor of possibility where every outcome seemed equally damaging, and yet he knew he couldn't stay isolated in that moment forever, because decisions in his world were never allowed the luxury of delay, and so when he finally reached for his phone, it wasn't with hesitation but with a grim sense of inevitability, dialing a number he had not used in a while, someone who could move quietly, someone who could confirm details without alerting the wrong people, someone who owed him enough favors to ask questions that shouldn't legally be asked, and while the phone rang, Bill's gaze drifted again to the vial, his thoughts returning not just to Hayley, but to the last time she had been in this office, the way she had stood near that same desk, the way she had avoided eye contact when he asked her where she had been the night before, brushing off the question with a smile that felt slightly too rehearsed, slightly too intentional, and at the time he had let it go because he wanted to believe in her version of events, but now every memory was being reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion, and when the call finally connected, Bill wasted no time, giving only what was necessary, a description of the vial, instructions to trace its chemical composition, its origin, and any possible link to recent acquisitions in private labs or black market pharmaceutical channels. And then he hung up without waiting for confirmation, because he didn't need reassurance, he needed answers. But even as he tried to shift into problem-solving mode, a knock at his office door broke the fragile structure of his focus. And before he could respond, the door opened anyway, revealing Hayley herself standing there, as composed as ever on the surface, but with something unsettled in her eyes that suggested she already sensed the shift in atmosphere, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, because both understood instinctively that something had changed between the last time they saw each other and this one. Something irreversible had entered the space between them, and Bill, instead of inviting her in, simply watched her carefully, his silence more revealing than any accusation could have been while Hayley slowly stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a controlled movement that did not match the tension tightening in her expression, and she asked him directly what was wrong, though the question itself felt almost unnecessary given the way he was looking at her, and Bill did not answer immediately, because part of him was still trying to decide how to approach her, whether to confront her outright or to test her first. But the silence stretched just long enough that Hayley's composure began to shift, just slightly, and she asked again, softer this time, whether something had happened, whether someone had been talking to him, and that was when Bill finally leaned back slightly in his chair, gesturing toward the desk without speaking, and Hayley followed his motion with her eyes, and when she saw the vial, Everything in her posture changed in a way she could not fully conceal. A flicker of recognition, a tightening in her jaw, a fraction of hesitation that lasted less than a second but was long enough to confirm that this was not unfamiliar to her, and Bill saw it immediately, registering it like a strike, because whatever explanation she might have given afterward, that moment had already spoken louder than words, and yet Hayley recovered quickly, too quickly, asking him where he had gotten it, insisting that it was not what it looked like, that there was context he clearly didn't have, but Bill interrupted her before she could build a narrative, telling her that Tomas had brought it to him, that it had been identified as poison, and that it had been traced back to her possession, and the way her expression tightened at the mention of Tomas told him even more than her reaction to the vial itself, because now there was not just evidence but a chain of people connected to it, and Hayley stepped closer to the desk, but not too close, as if she was trying to assess how much damage had already been done, and she began to explain quickly, almost too quickly, that the vial had been taken out of context, that it was part of something she had been investigating, something she had been trying to protect him from without involving him directly, but Bill had heard versions of protection before, and none of them had ever come packaged with poison. And so, he asked her plainly why she would ever be near something like that in the first place, and that question seemed to slow her down, forcing her to choose her words more carefully, and she said that she had been approached by someone offering information about a threat against him, that the vial had been presented as proof of intent, not as something she planned to use, but as something she was trying to prevent, and as she spoke, Bill studied her face, trying to determine whether there was truth buried in her explanation or whether it was simply another layer of strategy, because in his world both were equally possible, and yet something about the way she said it, the slight crack in her otherwise controlled voice, made him hesitate, and that hesitation was dangerous, because it meant he was no longer certain, and uncertainty was something he rarely allowed himself to tolerate, and Hayley, sensing that she had not completely lost him yet, stepped further into the room's emotional space, telling him that Tomas was not telling him everything, that he had his own agenda, that this entire situation was being shaped by people who did not want Bill to see the full picture. The silence in Bill's office did not break after Hayley finished speaking. Instead, it thickened, as if the room itself had become another participant in the conversation, absorbing every word, every doubt, every accusation that had not yet been spoken aloud, and Bill found himself staring at the vial again, not because he trusted it, but because it had become the only fixed point in a situation that kept shifting every time someone opened their mouth, and Hayley, still seated across from him, watched him carefully now, no longer speaking, because she understood that anything she added at this moment could either anchor her explanation or destroy it entirely, and Bill finally exhaled slowly, setting the vial down with deliberate care, as if treating it like evidence in a trial already underway in his mind, and he asked her again, more quietly this time, whether she was absolutely certain about what she was claiming, not because he wanted reassurance, but because he needed to see if her certainty would hold under pressure, and Hayley nodded, though not with confidence exactly, more with determination, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as him, and she repeated that she had not intended for him to see it this way, that Tomas had interpreted things incorrectly or selectively, and that someone had clearly guided him toward the most damaging conclusion, and Bill leaned back again, rubbing his jaw slowly as he considered that angle, because Tomas was not impulsive. He was precise, and precision meant intention, and intention meant someone had shaped the information before it ever reached Bill's desk, and that thought pulled his attention away from Hayley for a moment as he began mentally reconstructing the chain of events, starting from the first moment the vial could have entered circulation, who had access to it, who would benefit from its discovery, and who had the leverage to ensure Tomas was the one delivering it, and in that reconstruction, a troubling pattern began to emerge, one that suggested Hayley might not be the origin point at all, but instead a connector between multiple agendas he had not fully identified yet, and Hayley seemed to sense that shift in his thinking because she leaned forward slightly, telling him that if he was starting to consider Tomas as an unbiased source, then he was already being pulled into someone else's design. But Bill cut her off again, not harshly, but firmly, asking her to stop framing everything as manipulation unless she could explain why she had not come to him immediately with something this serious, and that question lingered in the air longer than either of them liked, because it struck at the core of trust rather than evidence, and Hayley hesitated again, this time longer, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, admitting that she had been trying to confirm the credibility of the threat before involving him, because if she had